On a winter night in 1944, in a cramped German headquarters somewhere in the Ardennes, a colonel stands over a map that's already starting to look like a crime scene. The red grease pencil has been used so often that it's worn down to a stub. Arrows for the great German offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, drive westward in bold strokes. American units are pushed back, names of villages scratched out and overwritten with German symbols. For the first time in months, the arrows point in the German direction, and then a courier comes in, snow still melting on his greatcoat, and hands the colonel a flimsy piece of paper. The colonel scans it. His jaw tightens. Without a word, he leans over the map and draws a new arrow. This one isn't German. It bends sharply north, coming out of the south like a knife to the ribs. Next to it, in rushed, ugly handwriting, he scribbles a single word, Patton. If you'd paused the war right there and walked through German headquarters, you would have seen the same name on map after map, circled, underlined, sometimes written in capital letters like a curse. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not Montgomery, Patton. Why? Why did men who'd marched with Guderian, who'd shattered Poland and France and driven to the gates of Moscow, end up fearing an American general who'd never fired a shot in the First World War? Why did one U.S. commander, in particular, make hardened German generals quietly tell interrogators years later that he was the one they dreaded most? To answer that, we have to do something unusual. We're not going to start with Patton. We're going to start with the people who feared him. Imagine you're a German staff officer in early 1943. You fought in the East. You've seen Soviet tank armies and Siberian divisions. Compared to that, the Americans in North Africa? They're a joke. Kasserine Pass proved it. The U.S. Army went into the mountains of Tunisia like a kid stepping into the ring with a heavyweight champion. Green troops, overconfident officers, poor communications. Rommel hit them the way a professional boxer hits a rookie, straight, hard, without mercy. American units panicked. Some broke and ran. Vehicles were abandoned. Guns left in firing positions without crews. German officers came back from the battle and described these new enemies as clumsy, brave, maybe, but slow, predictable, easy to fool. You can almost hear the contempt in their reports. Good equipment, plenty of it, but used badly. No real feel for maneuver warfare. No real nose for battle. In Berlin and in field headquarters across the theater, a quiet assumption settled in. The British were stubborn but methodical. The Americans were rich but inexperienced. They might win by sheer weight of metal, but they weren't dangerous in the way a Rommel or a Manstein would recognize as dangerous. And then, into that picture, walks George S. Patton. When Patton took over the battered U.S. II Corps in March 1943, German intelligence didn't even have his name spelled consistently. He was just another American general. What they couldn't see from their side of the front was what it felt like inside the American lines when he arrived. Patton stepped out of his jeep in North Africa wearing polished riding boots, jodhpurs, a custom-made jacket, a pair of ivory-handled pistols, and an expression that suggested he'd just bitten into something sour and found it wasn't nearly sour enough. He walked through camps where discipline had grown relaxed. Helmets off, uniforms sloppy, weapons not quite clean. Men smoking, laughing, relieved to be away from the front. And he exploded. He banned beards and ordered helmets on at all times, even miles from the front. Any man who fired his weapon carelessly would be court-martialed. Vehicles had to be parked facing one direction, ready to move. If a soldier didn't salute, Patton would pull him up personally and chew him out in language that would peel the paint off a tank. It looked like theater. It was theater, but Patton wasn't playing to the Americans. He was, in a strange way, playing to the Germans. Because at the heart of all that swagger was a question: can I turn this army from a lumbering mass into something the Germans will recognize as dangerous? Patty answer in German reports. Before Patton, comments on U.S. forces in Tunisia are almost smug. Clumsy attacks, poorly coordinated, weak infantry-tank cooperation. After Patton's first real battle in command, at El Getter, the tone shifts. It's subtle at first. Phrases start appearing like strong resistance, rapid counterattack, enemy recovered from surprise. American artillery becomes effective instead of chaotic. On the ground, German units that had expected an easy follow-up after Kasserine run into something different, a U.S. corps that doesn't crumble at the first blow, that regroups, that counterattacks fast instead of sitting in its trenches trying to figure out what just happened. It wasn't yet fear, but it was the end of complacency. Now, if you're watching this, you probably know the outline of Patton's career. North Africa, Sicily, France, the Bulge, Germany. But the men on the other side didn't experience it as Patton's greatest hits. They experienced it as a worsening problem that kept showing up on their maps, in their reports, in their nightmares. They noticed patterns, and patterns for a staff officer are more frightening than any individual battle. The first pattern emerged in Sicily. In July 1943, when the Allies invaded the island, the Germans expected, based on Tunisia, that the Americans would lumber forward while the British took the lead. The British Eighth Army under Montgomery landed in the southeast and punched its way up the island's spine, directly toward the well-defended eastern ports. Predictable, methodical. Exactly what German doctrine had prepared for. The Americans, under Patton, landed on the southern beaches. Their initial mission was modest: protect the flank, draw some German attention away from the British. Patton looked at that, and you can almost imagine the thought crossing his mind. Protect the flank? To hell with that. Let's use it. Instead of slowly grinding forward on a narrow axis, he wheeled his forces west and then north in a wide hook, racing along Sicilian roads that were never meant for. Tanks heading toward the port of Palermo. German and Italian commanders watching this weren't struck by the elegance of the maneuver at first. What struck them was the speed. Patton's columns were dust clouds on the horizon one day, and at the edge of key towns the next. They bypassed strong points, sent light forces ahead to seize crossings, showed an appetite for risk that felt uncomfortably familiar, because that was their playbook. The pre-war German army had built its doctrine around Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, fast, decisive, constantly looking to get around the enemy rather than smash straight through him. And in Sicily, for the first time, German officers saw an American general wielding his army the way they thought only Germans, occasionally Soviets, really knew how to do. There's a line in one post-war German account that sums it up. Speaking of the differences between Allied commanders, the officer said, and I'll paraphrase here, that most Americans were solid but slow, while Patton showed a grasp for mobile operations that reminded him of old German cavalry tactics. You can hear in that grudging praise the beginning of unease. The race from Messina, where Patton tried to beat Montgomery, to the northeastern tip of the island has often been framed as ego, and it certainly was that. He wanted the headlines. He wanted the glory. But from the German side, the ego wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that as German forces tried to conduct a disciplined withdrawal off the island, one of the few really successful large-scale retreats they pulled off in the war, they kept finding Patton's Americans threatening to cut their escape routes faster than anticipated. Time and again, they planned to hold a position for 3 days and be forced to abandon it after one because American columns had swung around a flank or grabbed a nearby town ahead of schedule. That alters your view of an opponent. When you sit down that night to write your situation report, you don't just write enemy advanced, you write enemy advance more quickly than expected. Multiply that note by a dozen staff officers in a dozen headquarters, and it filters up the chain. Patton's, which is how, over the second half of 1943, one name starts popping up more often in German intelligence summaries: Patton. Now, here's where this story takes a turn that's almost too good or too twisted to be true. Because the Germans didn't just develop an impression of Patton, the Allies helped them. They fed the German High Command a carefully constructed image of George S. Patton as the Allies' ultimate hammer, and the Germans swallowed it so completely that it changed the way they deployed entire armies. You think you've heard crazy war stories? Wait till you hear the one where a man's reputation pins down more divisions than some countries had in their entire army. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of France. The Germans knew it was coming. They didn't know where. Normandy was one possibility. The pass to Calais, where the channel is narrowest, was another. From a purely geographical standpoint, Calais made the most sense, so the Allies decided, let's make them sure it's Calais. That deception plan was called Operation Fortitude, and at the center of it, like the lead actor in an elaborate play, was George S. Patton. The British and Americans created an entire fictitious army group in southeast England, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It had insignia. It had fake radio traffic. It had dummy tanks made of wood and canvas parked under camouflaged nets. It had phony order of battle charts for German spies to discover, and on paper it had a commander, Patton. Why him? Why not Eisenhower, the supreme commander? Why not Bradley? Because by then, Allied intelligence knew what German intelligence believed. They'd been reading German decrypts. They'd been running double agents. They knew that German officers after North Africa and Sicily had tagged Patton as the most aggressive, dangerous American field commander. If he was in charge of forces in Kent, staring toward Calais, then, in German eyes, that had to be the main invasion threat, and that's exactly what happened. German intelligence files from the spring of 1944 show a growing obsession with this phantom army group. Reports filtered in, most of them planted about Patton inspecting his divisions in southeast England, touring airfields, reviewing tank units that existed only on paper and in canvas. On German maps, a fusag is marked in thick strength symbols opposite Calais. The 15th Army, one of their better armed formations, is kept in that sector, waiting for Patton's blow that never comes. Here's your first real, oh come on, they didn't really, did they, moment. They did. Weeks after the real landings in Normandy, long after Allied forces had battered their way off the beaches and into the bocage, Hitler and his staff refused to move key formations from the Calais area. Why? Because they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that Patton and his supposedly massive army group were still waiting across the Channel, ready to deliver the real invasion. One of the German generals later admitted that as long as they believed Patton was in England, they couldn't be sure Normandy wasn't a feint. The man wasn't even on the continent yet, and his name was already controlling German divisions. It's easy, with hindsight, to sneer at that, to say, how could they be so gullible? But put yourself back in their minds. They'd seen Patton in Tunisia and Sicily. They'd read the reports, speed, risk-taking, relentless pursuit. If you're a German officer steeped in the idea that war is decided by decisive, mobile blows, the kind of warfare you pride yourself on, you can't help but assume that when the Allies finally go for broke, this is the man they'll give the spearhead to, and that assumption, that mental model, is exactly what the Allies exploited. Now we get to the part the Germans really didn't enjoy, because eventually they realized Patton wasn't in Kent at all. He was in Normandy, with a real army, and he was coming for them. On August 1st, 1944, after the brutal, grinding hedgerow fighting that characterized the first 2 months after D-Day, the U.S. Third Army officially became operational under Patton. If you stand back and look at the Western Front from the German point of view, the days that follow are when Patton becomes something like a natural disaster. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had already punched a hole through the German lines near St. Lo. What Patton did was turn that hole into a widening rip. His divisions poured through the gap at Avranches, then fanned out like water released from a dam. Some raced west into Brittany, aiming to seize ports and cut off any hope of German counterattacks from that peninsula. Others swung east and south, driving into the open French countryside. German units that had grown used to the claustrophobic, close-range fighting of the bocage suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that could move 30, 40, 50 kilometers in a day. Imagine being a German regimental commander in that moment. Yesterday, your front line is here, your neighboring unit there. The map feels solid. Today, your neighbor is gone, withdrawn, overrun. It almost doesn't matter. Reports filter in that American tanks are already east of you, behind you, seizing bridges you assumed would be safe for days. You call Corps headquarters. They're already on the move. You ask where the new defensive line will be drawn. They have no answer because they don't know where Patton will be by nightfall. German staff diaries from that period are full of short, bitter, frustrated notes. Enemy speed exceeds expectations. Tank columns appear in rear areas, main effort difficult to identify, and through it all, one word appears again and again. Drit U.S. Army. Patton. 3rd U.S. Army. Patton. 3rd U.S. Army. Patton. We tend to think of fear in war as something that happens in foxholes, the fear of shells, bullets, bayonets. But there's another kind of fear that belongs to staff officers and generals. It's the fear of losing the plot, of not being able to predict, even roughly, what the enemy will do tomorrow. Patton terrified Germans at that level because he was, paradoxically, both predictable and unpredictable. They knew he'd attack. That part was certain. When in doubt, Patton pulled the trigger. He advanced. He sought contact, but how he exploited success, which direction he'd push a breakthrough, how far he'd go before pausing, which weak seam he'd sniff out felt far less predictable. One German general later contrasted him with Montgomery this way. The British commander, he said, planned like an engineer. You could almost see the blueprint of his offensives weeks in advance. Patton? More like a cavalry raider let loose across an entire theater. Let's pause on that for a moment and talk about culture, because one of the reasons Germans feared Patton more than other Allied generals has less to do with him and more to do with them. The pre-war German officer corps was steeped in a romanticized vision of the cavalry. Bold thrusts, deep penetrations, encirclements. The ideal commander was an aggressive, fast-moving leader who seized initiative and never let go. In the West, many German generals looked at their principal Allied opponents and saw competent managers, solid administrators, men they feared would gradually, inevitably, strangle them with material superiority, but who didn't really scare them in the way a Guderian or a Rommel could scare them. Patton was different. He was a throwback to an older martial ideal they understood and respected and dreaded. He talked about war as an art. He pushed his units to move faster than their supply trucks could comfortably sustain. He accepted casualties in pursuit of tempo in a way that, to German eyes, felt like something a German general should do, if he weren't trapped in Hitler's increasingly paranoid grip. You can see hints of this almost grudging admiration in post-war interviews. Several German officers, when asked to rate Allied generals, would put Patton at the top of the American list without hesitation. Now, you might be thinking, sure, but that's after the fact. That's memory. What about at the time? Fair question. Let's talk about one moment where German fear of Patton stopped being an abstract thing in a war diary and became a white-hot, immediate problem. The Ardennes. December 1944. Hitler's last great offensive in the West hinged on surprise and on time. Surprise, they got at least partially. Time? Time was stolen from them by logistics, weather, stubborn American defenders, and one U.S. general who refused to act according to their assumptions. If you read German planning documents for the Ardennes offensive, what we call the Battle of the Bulge, you see a consistent expectation. If they attacked hard through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, they could punch their way toward the Meuse River and perhaps even Antwerp before the Allies could react in strength. They knew Patton's Third Army was to the south, in Lorraine, oriented east towards the Saar and the West Wall. To get that entire army to pivot and drive north through winter conditions, with limited roads, would take in their estimation at least a week, probably more. So they gambled. By the time Patton became a real factor, the offensive would already have created an unsalvageable mess on the Allied side. When the attack began on December 16th, many German commanders felt vindicated. American units were overrun or surrounded. The front wavered, then bent backward. Villages changed hands twice in a day. You can imagine the mood in some of those headquarters. Cigarettes. Coffee. The first cautious talk, not of victory, They weren't that naive by then, but of a major success that might force the Allies to negotiate. And then, very quickly, reality began to intrude. Stubborn pockets of resistance, fuel shortages, Allied air power reappearing as the weather cleared, and the reports started to come in from the south. Third Army? It was moving. Fast. Here's where the story gets almost comically unfair from the German point of view, because what they didn't know was that Patton had been planning for their offensive before it even began. In early December, in a meeting with Eisenhower and other commanders, he'd argued that the Germans still had one more major attack left in them, and that the Ardennes, that quiet sector full of holiday leaves and green units, was a likely target. His staff, under the brilliant operations officer Hugh Gaffey and others, drew up contingency plans for turning Third Army north against a hypothetical German penetration. So when the real offensive erupted, Patton didn't have to start from zero. He basically said, at that now famous meeting in Verdun on December 19th, "I can attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room, according to those present, went quiet. Eisenhower asked him if this was just his usual aggressive talk. Patton insisted it wasn't. He'd already set it in motion. Think for a second about what that means on the German side. You're planning an offensive that counts, implicitly, on Patton needing a week to react. You're counting on a slow Allied decision cycle. And instead, within days, his entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, is in motion, swinging 90 degrees in snow and ice, heading straight for the southern flank of your carefully constructed Bulge. German accounts after the war are very clear about the psychological impact. It wasn't just that Third Army reached Bastogne and relieved the surrounded American paratroopers there on December 26th. It was that Patton's movement shattered the German sense of having any operational breathing space. One general, describing the moment they realized how quickly Third Army was closing, simply said, "Then our attack had no more chance." They were suddenly on the receiving end of the kind of fast, flank-crushing countermove they themselves had used in 1940. Some of them, in private, admired it. Many more simply cursed it. And that, really, is where Patton turned from a dangerous opponent into something closer to a legend in German minds. North Africa had shown he could stiffen a beaten army. Sicily had shown he could move quickly on a theater scale. France had shown he could break open a front and exploit a gap like a force of nature. The Ardennes showed something else, that even in the winter of 1944-45, when the German army was exhausted but still dangerous, this American general could think and act inside their decision loop. He didn't just hit hard, he hit first. At this point you might be tempted to say, all right, that's pretty straightforward. Germans feared Patton because he was aggressive, fast, effective. He reminded them of their own best generals. Case closed. But there's another layer to this story, and it's one that almost never makes it into the popular accounts. Because after the war ended, after the guns fell silent and the maps were rolled up, many of those same German officers who had spent years fearing Patton sat down at desks, lit cigarettes, and started writing. They wrote memoirs. They wrote studies for the U.S. Army. They sat for interviews with historians, including one particularly influential British writer named Basil Liddell Hart. And in those pages, in those conversations, they didn't just describe Patton. They created him, or at least, they created the version of Patton that you and I inherited. Let's talk about why. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the Western Allies had a problem. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union, yesterday's ally, was today's looming threat. Suddenly the question, how did the Germans fight, wasn't academic. It was a matter of practical military interest. So the U.S. Army and others started asking former German officers to write detailed accounts of their campaigns. These became the Foreign Military Studies, hundreds of monographs on everything from tank tactics to corps-level operations. In these papers, the Germans analyzed their Allied opponents. They ranked them. They discussed strengths and weaknesses. At the same time, writers like Liddell Hart were pursuing their own projects, trying to show that the kind of maneuver warfare they had advocated between the wars had been vindicated sometimes, they suggested, by the Germans themselves. Now imagine you're a former Wehrmacht general in 1948. You've lost the war. Your country is in ruins. You're trying to rebuild your reputation not as a Nazi, but as a professional soldier. You're writing for an audience that's deeply suspicious of anything that sounds like praise of the Red Army. You're also very aware that the people paying for your research and reading your interviews are American and British. Whom do you praise? If you want to flatter your new patrons and emphasize professional soldiering as the decisive factor in war, not ideology, not genocide, not Hitler's madness, you have every incentive to talk up the skill of certain Allied generals. And among the Americans, Patton is almost tailor-made for that role. He's aggressive. He's a student of tactics. He's colorful. He's not the political supreme commander that's Eisenhower, so praising him doesn't get tangled up in higher-level strategy. So you'll find in these post-war accounts a kind of chorus line. Patton was the most effective U.S. field commander we faced. Patton showed an understanding of mobile warfare rare among the Allies. Patton was the only American general we truly feared at the operational level. Now don't misunderstand me. These weren't pure inventions. As we've seen, there was a very real basis for German respect and fear of Patton. But memory is not a photograph. It's an edited film. Those German officers were cutting their own highlight reel. Every time they praised Patton's dash across France, they were implicitly saying, "See, we were beaten by a worthy foe, using methods we ourselves respect. It wasn't just overwhelming numbers. It wasn't just industry. It was generalship. That makes defeat easier to swallow. It also happens to flatter the post-war Western narrative, that the war in the West was won by a combination of industrial strength and brilliant commanders, with Patton as perhaps the most cinematic embodiment of the latter. So yes, German generals feared Patton more than any other American commander, but they also needed to remember him that way. He became a convenient mirror. They could look at Patton and see, reflected back, an image of their own pre-war ideals stripped of Nazi ideology, dressed in an American uniform, victorious where they had ultimately failed. And that's where the story starts to blur, just a little, around the edges. Because if you zoom out beyond the Western Front, beyond the U.S. Army, and ask German generals, whom did you fear most among all your enemies, the answers get more complicated. Many of them, especially those who served in the East, would tell you in hushed tones about Soviet commanders like Zhukov or Rokossovsky, men who wielded whole fronts, millions of men with terrifying bluntness and growing skill. Others would talk, not about individuals at all, but about Allied air power, which turned daylight movement into a suicide pact. Yet when they spoke specifically about Americans, when they were asked, which U.S. general gave you the biggest headaches, the reply came back over and over in one form or another, Patton. So where does that leave us? Let's rewind one last time to that German colonel in the Ardennes in December 1944, pencil hovering over the map, the word Patton scrawled alongside a red arrow. What exactly was he afraid of? He wasn't afraid of Patton's pistols or his profanity. He wasn't afraid of the speeches, the mythology, the reincarnation talk, the legend of a warrior born in the wrong age. He was afraid of what those things added up to on a battlefield. He feared an opponent who understood instinctively, viscerally, that in modern industrial war, time is a weapon. Patton used time the way a skilled swordsman uses the thrust. He was always looking for that half-second when the enemy's guard was down. Germany's generals, for all their doctrine and talent, had spent the first years of the war playing that game better than anyone. They'd been the ones appearing on other people's maps like a sudden, unwanted arrow. By 1944, staring at a front collapsing from all sides, they realized something bitter. Their own style of war was now being used against them by a nation whose soldiers, only a year or two earlier, they dismissed as clumsy amateurs. So no, Patton didn't win the war in Europe single-handed. He didn't always get it right. He made mistakes. He sometimes outran his supply lines, sometimes pushed attacks that cost more in lives than they gained in ground. But to the men on the other side of the hill, he represented something far more frightening than a flawless genius. He represented an enemy who was still learning, and learning fast. An enemy with factories that never seemed to stop rolling out tanks and planes, now led, in critical sectors, by a general who moved with the speed, aggression, and ruthlessness they'd long believed only they possessed. When you put all of that together, the theater of his persona, the hard edge of his doctrine, the way his name was weaponized in deception plans, the speed of his response in crises like the Bulge, you begin to understand why German generals, even years later, when the war was over and done, still spoke of him with a mixture of respect and something close to dread. In their war, surrounded by the roar of artillery and the grind of tank treads, there were few truly quiet moments, but every so often, a German staff officer, late at night, might have looked at a new report, seen that name on the page, and felt his stomach drop. Patton. Not because he was larger than life on a movie screen, but because somewhere out there in the dark, a real army was moving faster than their plans and closing in. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. In the end, what they feared wasn't the man. It was the realization that, by the time they fully understood him, he'd already passed them on the road to their own defeat.